Uh, are we live? Yes. A very good evening, all the history enthusiasts. It's a pleasure to have you all again with us today here on this YouTube channel of the history enthusiasts. And today we have with us Christhu Doss, assistant professor of, excuse me, assistant professor of modern and contemporary history, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Sir, we are very honored to have you on our platform. I welcome you on behalf of the entire History Enthusiasts core committee as well as our members and audience. We also have with us today Honorary President of the History Enthusiasts, Sri Nandan Shastri, sir. Sir, welcome you on behalf of myself and Nidhi. And I also welcome my dearest friend and co-host of today's session, Ms. Nidhi Katti, founder vice president of the History Enthusiasts. And most importantly, I like to welcome all the audience members whose constant support has been an inspiration to us to keep going forward and to keep organizing such meaningful lectures and events. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I now request Ms. Nidhi Katti to introduce our today's resource person.
Thank you so much, Manali, for the warm welcome. And I also take this opportunity to welcome you also. As a president, founder president, you have always supported new ideas. Thank you so much. And warm welcome to the session. I take this opportunity to introduce our today's resource person, Professor Christhu Doss. He teaches modern and contemporary history at Center for Historical Studies, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He is author of two books, and the books entitled are Colonialism and Communalism, Religion and Changing Identities in Modern India. And the second one is India after the 1857 revolt, Decolonizing the Mind. These are the two books. And his latest research articles include the some of the titles include as following: Pedagogy of Scheduled Women and Changing Feminities in Colonial India 1830 to 1942, Gandhiji and RSS, The Cultural Grounding of Social Representations, Indian Historical Review, and Abvalent Declarations. This is one of the three particular important recent research papers which Sir has published. And he has a history channel also, where continuously he is going through a lot of discussions regarding history, different lectures. Recently, Sir also organized a lecture on public history, the concept of public history, which was also very interesting. Um, and he also has a discussion forum called UCHS, Understanding Culture, History and Society. So people who are interested in these topics can of course reach out to Source talks and sessions which he has conducted through his YouTube channel. It is available. We will surely post the link in the chat box during the session. It was very warm to know about Sir and his works. And it's a privilege to have him on the platform of the history enthusiast. Now I request Professor Christhu Doss, sir, to take the stage and start his lecture. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Nidhi, for such a wonderful, uh, interaction that we had earlier also. And this is, I see, in continuation of what we have been doing. And particularly, I have to thank Professor Nandan Shastri and Manali, and most importantly, Nidhi, for organizing such a wonderful interactive session. I always see this as not a lecture as normally it used to be. It's an interactive session. I would like to interact with those who would like to ask questions on this particular topic that I am interested in. And I find this history enthusiast group, I'm sure, has been doing a lot of such seminars, talks, and interactive sessions. Now, the topic that I have chosen is part of my book, as Nidhi has already introduced. This is actually the book. The title of the book is Colonialism and Communalism, Religion and Changing Identities in Modern India. It was published a few months ago, 2024. And this is also part of my ongoing research. So, the topic that I have chosen, which I have titled it slightly and modified it, The Gospel of Victorian Communalism in Modern India. So, the topic is, for me, is important for a variety of reasons. Before I go into the details of the topic, as a student of history, I always would like to recollect some of the historical ideas of a few historians. For example, E.H. Carr, R.C. Majumdar, R.G. Collingwood, and Jadunath Sarkar, of course. Why I'm using all these scholars? Of course, there are other scholars also I will be using during the course of my discussion. These scholars continue to help me as a student of history to look at things differently. So when I say things, looking at things differently, I recollect what E.H. Carr said, because as a student of history, we all know as history is a continuous process of interaction between past and present, and it is also seen as an unending dialogue of historians and their facts. So I see this research that I have undertaken is also an ongoing process. So whatever the findings that I could see in my research, I will be able to share with you all. So which means, again, there is also possibility for discussion, debate, dissent, and disagreement. And similarly, I also use R.C. Majumdar's ideas for a variety of reasons. The most important is I remember some of his writings where he would constantly underline the fact that history needs to be rewritten. History needs to be rewritten largely to take account of new facts or new interpretation of known facts, but certainly with an intention to support any political ideology. I think this is something which seems to be missing in the historical writings. So, whenever I use rewriting history, I'm not using, therefore, in any controversial political, ideological perspective, but when a person or a student of history gets new facts, or a student of history wants to reinterpret of known facts, and therefore it's always possible that we need to ask questions. And here comes R.G. Collingwood. I always find it interesting when I read R.G. Collingwood's idea, because he says every new generation must rewrite history in its own way. Every new historian should not be satisfied by answering to old questions. Rather, historians need to revise the questions themselves. This is also another important way in which I get new insight, that the communalism, of course, as a historical theme, has often been discussed by different historians differently and interpreted differently. But now, what I can think or rethink or question. And I think this is very important. The theme that I have chosen is also therefore based on these historians' ideas. It is in this context I also use Jagannath Sarkar's idea that the first duty of a historian, he says, is to explore those aspects of Indian history or Indian society that were deliberately overlooked by colonial writers. See, this is something whenever you discuss communalism or what I would call it Victorian communalism, I would explain who has coined this term and why I'm using it. It's always important to contextualize these terms. Now, as a student of history, therefore, I would like to ask three questions. So, my research questions in this presentation, therefore, are thematically connected. For example, the first question that I would like to ask is when exactly was it that the term communalism was used, at least in an academic sense of the term, and what context it was used? The second question is what are the ways in which colonialism and communalism in India have been understood in the second half of the 20th century and in the recent past by both Indian historians and historians elsewhere? And the third important question that I would be asking here is why the idea of Victorian communalism as an inalienable part of British colonialism needs to be understood historically and critically. So, therefore, my major themes of today's interactive session are centered around the general understanding of communalism worldwide. Second, colonialism and communalism, particularly in the Indian context. And third, how this new idea called Victorian communalism is closely linked with the British colonialism, which has not been given adequate attention so far. We always talk about colonialism and communalism, most importantly in the 20th century or maybe 19th century, largely part of divide and rule. But I feel that still adequate attention has not been paid, particularly in this context, Victorian communalism. Now, the most important aspect, as far as the first important question, when exactly was it that the term communalism was used for the first time, and what is the context with which this term was used? I find it personally very interesting here. The actual use of the term communalism, if you read the American anarchist theorist Murray Bookchin, he is believed to have coined this term communalism in the early 20th century. And the point which I'm emphasizing here is Murray Bookchin was a noted anarchist theorist, and he's known widely for his books, for example, Towards an Ecological Society, The Limits of the City, The Post-Scarcity Anarchism, and most recently, Social Ecology and Communalism. In this book, The Social Ecology and Communalism, I hardly find this book is quoted in any of the scholarly works on communalism, particularly with specific reference to India, and which is why I'm interested here. Murray Bookchin, in this particular book, Social Ecology and Communalism, he argues very clearly that communalism, at least maybe in the European context or in the American context, what he is trying to tell us is a refreshingly a new political framework. And he tells us that this study, particularly social ecology and communalism, is perhaps an extension of his earlier works on social ecology. And by this study, he tries to, explain how communalism as a political framework has a rich potential that could abolish two things. One is social hierarchy and enhancing economic inequality. See, this is the definition given by the American thinker Murray Bookchin in his book Social Ecology and Communalism. So for him, communalism therefore is a refreshingly new political framework that has a rich potential that could abolish social hierarchy and enhance economic inequality. I'm not going into the details. So, how there are different and changing dynamics about the same terminology. So, communalism. Now, therefore, for Murray, communalism is a fascinating blend of what he would call libertarian municipalism. Libertarian municipalism with the best of the anarchist and Marxist traditions. And therefore, communalism for him is usually refers or used to refer to a system that integrates communal ownership and federations of highly localized independent communities. And he also maintains that a prominent libertarian socialist, he defines the communalism as a political philosophy, which of course he developed as a theory of government or a system of government in which independent communes participate in a federation, as well as the principles and practice of communal ownership. I'm not going into the details of this particular aspect. I'm just talking about one aspect of communalism that he tried to expand, which has the potential to create an equality. Now, let us come back to the another aspect of communalism, communal rhetoric. So, here, most importantly, how colonialism and communalism need to be understood. I think it's very important. When we look at 18th and 20th centuries, this is part of my second question. What are the ways in which colonialism and communalism in India have been understood as an ideology? I'm not saying that particular theory which Murray has developed in any way is applicable in the Indian context, and it is highly debatable. It may be an ideal approach. I'm not going into the details of it, but I'm just trying to understand how this term that was coined or believed to have been coined by Murray was used in a specific context, which later was defined or redefined multiple times by many scholars in a different context, particularly in India, as we all know, is used or being used in a different context. So when we look at 18th and 20th centuries, Britain was revered, as we all know, the empire on which the sun never sets, as I'm sure all of us know. This clearly signifies the vastness of its empire. It is also estimated that Britain controlled roughly 25 or more than 25% of the Earth landmass, which means that there was always daylight in one of its territories, which is obviously the reason why the phrase, the empire on which the sun never sets, is often used. Now, my question is how colonialism, therefore, needs to be understood in the larger context. First, before I go into the details of colonialism, in India, I think it's always a good idea. There are always similarities, more similarities than differences. For example, when you look at colonialism in India, we always see that colonialism in Africa resulted in the making of class struggles and the identity politics, the politics that are centered around ethnicity. And of course, it also created colonization, not just political, but mind, colonizing the mind. And these were the strategies, of course, introduced by the colonists, particularly the British, in order to perpetuate their rule and domination of African territories. And an example is the British colonial policy of divide and rule. Maybe in Africa, particularly Nigeria, could be a classical example. Now, colonization often led to, in the African case, as I'm sure most of us are familiar with, led to series of challenges. The most important aspect of colonization in Africa is, displacement of indigenous peoples, the imposition of new systems of government, new economic production, the spread of European culture, among other things. Many cases, the effects of colonialism, as we all know, were obviously negative from the people's perspective, particularly the colonized perspective. And this resulted in, I'm sure all of us would agree with me on this, led to exploitation, violence, poverty, and many more other social evils. Now, here, what is the uniqueness of colonialism in India, which was different from colonialism in Africa, for example? And which is why we have to be a little more careful when we discuss the idea of communalism. For example, communalism in India, particularly after the colonizing powers, Portuguese, Dutch, Danish, and most importantly, English, there are two schools of thought. So there's no single idea about communalism. There are two schools of thought. One school of thought within the British historical, tradition is communalism is an outgrowth of Indian tradition. When we say outgrowth of Indian tradition, these scholars would say this, that it is something culturally specific, like the caste system. And therefore, Britishers were not the only people who were responsible, or colonizers are the only people who were responsible for the communal politics. The Indians have to blame themselves because of the hierarchical social structure. Of course, it is debatable. The second school of thought would definitely say that communalism is a distortion produced by a manipulative colonial power in the interests of divide and rule. And for example, scholars like Gyanendra Pandey, who is also one of the proponents of this school of thought that challenges colonialism as the root cause for communal politics. And of course, he says communalism is a form of colonialist knowledge. But I find that it's very important. Of course, I agree with this particular ideology, but what is the root of this argument? So I hardly see that he is able to go to the root of the problem. Of course, most of the historians would definitely agree with me on this, that communalism and colonialism cannot be separated, because in India, communal politics is nothing but a product of colonialism or colonial forms of knowledge. But how do we situate it? And how do we go back to the root of this communal politics in the colonial context? I think this is what I am interested in, how this needs to be understood historically and critically. And similarly, historians like Bipan Chandra, Partha Chatterjee, uh, and others would also argue that communalism is a kind of pathology of nationalism, which is something which was always used to divide the people on grounds of religion and other identities. And if you go slightly earlier period, Chandranath Basu, for example, is often seen as someone who popularized or coined the term Hindutva, the book that he wrote in 1890s, particularly in 1892, if I'm not wrong. The book Hindutva, which he wrote in Bangla, was always seen as a very important intervention, particularly against the colonial exploitative imperialist policies. And he emphasized, Chandranath Basu, for example, emphasized Hindu values and ways of life against the British. And I think this is very, very important. There are multiple narratives about communalism, and the scholars who try to challenge the communal politics of the colonial British and coining of the term Hindutva even before this term became very popular in the 20th century. One has to therefore look at the larger dynamics behind this communal politics. Similarly, when you read Ashish Nandi, you also find communalism, he would say it is a pathology or disease of modernity um, that attacked India under British rule. But it's a wonderful argument. But when you argue something without actually contextualizing it within the broader rubric of what I would call Protestantism, I still find it would be incomplete, at least as far as the colonialism or Victorian communalism is concerned in India. And the latest study, as we all know, Richard Fox, Communalism in India, he would clearly say that communalism in India clearly depends on religion as an ideology. And he says religion in the West is, for the most part, a matter of faith. Communalism as a parochial ideology that emerged primarily as a consequence of the British cultural project. I think this is a very, very important argument that I would like to emphasize here. And many scholars later have tried to analyze how there's a close connection between colonialism and communalism. I am not stopping colonialism as a communalism as an integral part of colonialism. I'm going a little deeper within colonialism to be more specific how Protestantism played a crucial role. Protestantism. I do agree with almost all the scholars mentioned above But my study, therefore, is different. Different largely in the context because most of the scholars have not used this term, Victorian communalism. This is not my term, actually. I have taken this from a very, very important recent study that talks about how there used to be violence century beginnings and the 19th century also, the second half of the 19th century. There are always violence between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. And the Protestants and Catholics, their violence were always seen as something, an integral part of Victorian communalism. So I have picked this Victorian communalism from the Northern Ireland context. But if you ask me whether this will be applicable in the Indian context, I do think so, because it is not a conflict between Catholics versus Protestants in the India. It becomes Protestantism versus others. Protestantism versus others. I'm not using the term Protestant state, but I'm using the Protestant ethics, how it shaped the colonial British when they were in India for about 200 plus years. Now, why we have to say this or we have to admit it? Of course, you have every right to debate or discuss or disagree with me on this. So, look at from the 1813 onwards, Charter Act, or even before the Charter Act, wherever you see Portuguese colonies, you find the Portuguese missionaries. Dutch colonies, Dutch missionaries. Danish colonies, Danish missionaries. English, there may be some exceptional cases, but you find, particularly after 1813, the floodgates of proselytization politics were opened through this Charter Act. Now, if you ask me the question whether all the rulers were religious oriented or religious minded, that may not be. But you see this so called religious neutrality followed by the colonial British, I find needs to be subjected to critical scrutiny. In theory, of course, it may be argued that religious neutrality was followed by the British, but in practice, I have a serious problem with this particular idea of religious neutrality. So, when I use Victorian communalism, I mean how the Protestant ethics or Protestant ideology was used most subtly, not in an open, aggressive, or assertive way of imposing. See, whatever the reforms they have introduced in India, be it abolition of sati or widow remarriage or any other issues that they have taken up, and the ways in which they sought to replace educational system in English education, or challenging the traditional Indian education, or in otherwise the ways in which they try to democratize Indian education, as often they used to claim. This clearly tells us that their politics of modernity or modernization is something which is closely linked with their Victorian idea of communalism, the Victorian idea of Europeanization. Of course, you can challenge this argument, but the available data that I am presenting before you are mostly archival sources from Nehru Memorial Museum and Library in Bangalore, Theological Seminary, and Germany. You have Frankfurt Halle Library. So these sources clearly tell us that colonialism and communalism, particularly Protestantism, played a crucial role. So, my argument, therefore, is colonialism and communalism in India cannot be understood without adequately referencing what I would call Victorian morality. So, how this Victorian morality can also be seen as a Victorian communalism. Now, why I am particular, the third question is very important now. I'll take few minutes. The question that I would often ask to myself, why the idea of Victorian communalism is an inalienable part of British colonialism that needs to be understood historically and critically. Once you ask this question, obviously you will go back to the roots of the Indian cultural or tradition or civilizational ethos. What way this Victorian morality or Victorian communalism challenged the Indian traditional ethos? For example, um, this study therefore critiques how colonialism and missionary politics sought to set off a somewhat disastrous momentum, precipitating communal rhetoric, which I think in turn challenged the entrenched noble Indic philosophical and inclusive civilizational tradition, which I'm sure all of us are familiar with, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The world is one family. For the first time, this idea of secularism or inclusive society um, underwent a series of changes because of institutionalization of inequality or imposition of Western ethos and ideas, or proclaiming that they are superior and therefore Indian needs their idea of education, their idea of science, their idea of technology, their idea of infrastructural development, and therefore I find therefore everything seeing as inferior, and therefore that's a superior civilization is needed. I'm sure this is a very common understanding. I'm sure we are all familiar with. And this is one of the reasons why I use the term communalism to refer to a parochial ideology. So, what is my definition of communalism? I would like to differ from the existing scholars' definition, because my term of secularism or secular is different largely in the context of Victorian communalism. So I'm using this term communalism largely as a term which in a way tells us how it is parochial and became very divisive, particularly during the British time. And why do I use the communalism term in particular? Those who follow this ideology, this communal ideology or parochial ideology, appear to think that they have nothing to do with the noble things that are there in other religious traditions, which means you don't take the noble ideas of other religions very seriously, because you are trained or indoctrinated in such a way that your truth is absolute truth and therefore no other truth exists in the world. And those who follow these ideas of Victorian communalism also claim that they have the monopoly of truth to disseminate. And therefore, they assert that they have every right to proselytize and proclaim that they have everything to teach and nothing to learn from other faiths. So, this is the definition which I would like to suggest in this study of colonialism and communalism. And why do I use this term secularism or secular? Again, I am differing from the existing scholarly interpretations, primarily because I am trying to understand communalism from the Protestantism perspective or the Victorian communalist perspective. And it is in this context, the term secularism or secular I'm using to refer to those who hold the view that all religions are equal, at least in theory. Maybe we always find differences, but this is something which normally seen or not understood properly. So the term secular, which I'm using here, is those who hold the view that all religions are equal. And therefore, those who follow this ideology keep themselves away from undermining the various ideas present in other religious traditions. And they never assert that they have a monopoly of truth. Particularly, it is all about monopoly of truth. That is precisely the problem is, which most of the scholars seem to uh, ignore, maybe for various reasons. So the monopoly of truth is therefore a very, very important and central aspect of my discussion. And it is in this context I would define the ways in which Protestant, particularly in the 19th century, defined the idea of uh, communalism. See, the term communalism has connected history. If you look at the Protestants' idea of communalism, again, I think it's very important. They all believed that the community that they were always advocating Christianity, and they try to see Protestantism is a religious denomination that, in a way, is primarily known for creating a communionism. See, this is a connected history. Communalism comes from the term communionism and communitarianism. So, communionism, communitarianism, and communalism. So, it is very important. And the root cause of these isms is nothing but Protestantism. It is Protestantism that tried to create these ideas: communionism, communitarianism, and communalism. So, for example, the Christian ethics, as some of the missionaries would say in general, and Protestant ethics in particular, are inherently communitarian. So, this communitarian idea believes in church fellowship, intimate spiritual communion, and community association. I repeat, church fellowship, intimate spiritual communion, and community association. If you look at these concepts, you will find that there's nothing wrong in it. This is how it is often seen. But I'm not making any sweeping generalization here, because the way in which the Protestant ethics, or those who advocated the ideas of Protestantism, believed that Protestantism is nothing but it is all about community consciousness, communitarianism, and communionism. In fact, the followers of Christianity in Europe, particularly in Protestant traditions, and in India, they're all trained to believe and faithfully follow some of the biblical principles that seem to suggest that church is nothing but a body with Christ as its head, and who is the head, and therefore the followers of Christ are expected to be members of a church as a community. This is, I think, wonderful idea, maybe. But how this colonial masters may be used or misused or interpreted or misinterpreted or appropriated in a different way, which led to a series of, uh, you know, destabilization, destability. Now, the point which I'm emphasizing here is colonialism and missionary politics. Definitely, I'm not making any sweeping generalization, but one would definitely understand that there is an intricate interconnectedness between British political class and proselytizing missionary agencies. So, my argument, therefore, is the Victorian communalism cannot be understood maybe in its entirety without analyzing the role played by the political class in Britain and the proselytizing missionary agencies. And of course, you have a larger role of industrial revolution and the capitalism and the sponsoring of missionary agencies from London to various parts of the world that also, in a way, facilitated the colonial British to expand the communal politics in nuanced ways. One would not see that it is communal in its first place, but when you analyze it little more deeper, you will find that everywhere you find the elements which are divisive, sectarian, and very sensitive as far as religion and secular life of the British politics is concerned. Now, I'll take few more minutes, then I'll stop, then I will look for questions. Now, I always find when I say Victorian communalism, normally there may be a question. Was there any close connection between colonialism and missionaries? Well, this is a wonderful question. But if you look at the history of Madras presidency or Bengal presidency or Bombay presidency, the cases may be different. So what happened in Bengal may not be the case in Bombay, or what happened in Bombay may not be the case in Madras presidency. But you always find there's a common ground that seemed to have united these two entities, in the political class and the religious entities. When I say political class, the rulers and the agencies, missionary agencies in particular. So, as in my study, I find that yes, you cannot say that there is a close connection or direct relationship between colonialism and missionary politics, but the ways in which they worked closely, the ways in which they understood their tasks closely, and the ways in which they interacted or delegated their responsibilities, as Rudyard Kipling would call it, the white man's burden, clearly indicate yes, there are clear cases where you will find that colonial government and missionary organizations went hand in hand, maybe directly or indirectly. They may not, the colonial class or the colonial officials may not be interested to identify themselves as Christians, but as officials or in their personal capacities or as Britons, you find that there are more similarities than differences. This is the core argument. When I use Victorian communalism, I am not only using missionary politics, I am also using the political class, the close understanding between these two entities, and the close interactions between these two ideologically significant groups, and the manner in which they worked closely. Of course, there were differences between missionaries and the political class, but you always find very, very, close linkages. For example, missionaries often claimed, I hardly see the colonial officials, they have a consensus on this, but missionaries often claimed that all their friends or our friends, all their friends here mean all the friends of the political class or the friends of the missionaries. And all the enemies of the political class are the enemies of the missionaries. And the missionaries would always say that they are proud of the same country, inherent glorious history, and rally around the same throne. And one thing is very important, which I find it very interesting. Both missionaries and the political class are often found to be on the same page. For example, next to being Christians, they rejoiced that they are Britons. So when we say Victorian communalism is something which has not been discussed in the historical context, I do see, yes, it has not been discussed adequately. Because most of the time it is often seen that British political class followed religious neutrality and therefore it has not affected much the missionary politics, and missionaries were often seen as autonomous body and therefore they hardly interacted with the political class. Here we have evidences. These are all archival uh, proof and letters exchanged between missionaries, particularly in South India, and missionary and their sponsors in London, and the missionaries' correspondence in with the political class. Our political class, I mean, here within India. And another important thing, the commonality, which I say that also strengthened the Victorian communalism, is while the rulers cared for the temporal needs of the colonized masses, missionaries were anxious for the spiritual growth of the colonized masses. So, here is another important aspect that has not been given adequate attention. So, as I told you, I am using Victorian communalism as a term from the very important work titled Communal Violence in the British Empire. This is a very important book by Mark Doyle. And here, as I already told you, one thing is very clearly expressed. If this Victorian communalism is used in the European context to refer to the violent conflict between Catholics and Protestants, I'm sure the same Victorian communalism, which most of the historical texts don't refer to understand communal politics in India, and which is why I'm interested to apply in the Indian context, because it is not a division between Protestantism and Catholics, it is a division between Protestant ethics versus others. In other words, the Victorian communalism is something which sought to create an unique identity through its ideas, ideologies, images, and imaginings. And which is why, as a student of history, I would like to ask questions. So I'm not satisfied by answering to old questions. Rather, I would always prefer to ask new questions, because this is something which needs to be understood historically and critically. Because communalism, it's not just between Hindus or Muslims or any other community. We have to go back to the root. as a student of history. Otherwise, I'm sure this Victorian communalism will remain unnoticed, and the politics that was responsible for divide and rule uh, will ever be known to all of us. Now I'll take 2 more minutes, then I'll stop here. So, what are my findings in my book? My argument, three quick arguments, then I'll stop. Um, of course, there are many studies on communalism. Communalism in India, Hindu Muslim communalism, or the 20th century communal politics. But my argument is any discussion on communalism in India as it is understood today would make little sense without referencing Victorian communalism, because it is this Victorian communalism that was characterized by political dominance, cultural hegemony, religious supremacy, and most importantly, this communalism played a very important role in creating partition also. So one should not forget how they were able to create a series of repercussions. And finally, it resulted in a huge, serious damage in the history of India. The second important argument is communalism. I'm using, as I already told you, as a parochial ideology that emerged primarily as a consequence of British cultural project of control. See, this is very important. It's a cultural project of control. There, it has been already stated by various scholars. But how this cultural project of colonialism needs to be examined further. I'm sure, as students of history like me, many of the scholars may be exploring the cultural aspect of colonialism, but I find personally that it needs to be explored critically and seriously more now more than ever before, because the cultural project of control, as I understand, in a way was efficacious in creating a relatively homogeneous religious identity or confederation of religious identities. I'm talking in the worldwide Protestant ethics. Even though the present day situation may be different and changing, but this Protestantism driven cultural project of control cannot be taken slightly, because it has a rich potential that can create, or that created in the history in various parts of the world wherever you find the colonialism existed. And this particular aspect, therefore, was successful, at least partly, in creating religious identity and confederation of religious identities, or polemically confronted and entrenched the composite culture of the multicultural Indian society. And India is a perfect case study how the British were able to confront the entrenched composite culture of the multicultural Indian society. And the third argument, which I would be interested to share, because what was the implication of such Victorian communalism? I don't find any major reactionary response in the Indian subcontinent, at least in the 19th century or early part of the 20th century. In South India, we are told that there are many organizations like Sadhurveda Siddhanta Sabha in 1840s, Hindu Preaching Society in 1880s, Hindu Tract Society in 1887, and in North India also you have some of the Reformation movements. For example, Dharma Sabha in 1830, Sanatan Dharm Rakshini Sabha in Bengal, Hindu Dharm Prakashik Sabha, Sanatan Dharma Sabha in 1890s, um, and Sanatan Dharma societies in Haridwar and Delhi. I am telling these names at least to name a few. These organizations became inevitable, and in a way, these organizations challenged Victorian communalism by strengthening or emboldening or disseminating the ideas of Hinduism, or popularizing some of the ideas of Hinduism, or reforming some of the beliefs and practices. And these organizations, therefore, need to be understood in the larger context of colonialism and Victorian communalism. So, otherwise, why there is a need for the emergence of these series of organizations? These organizations were not against any other religious tradition. These organizations, as I understand, uh, became possible or became a historical reality largely because they felt that there is a threat to the Indian cultural, religious, or civilizational ethos. So it is in this context, of course, we find that the Victorian communalism or Victorian communal politics, through institutionalization of Victorian morality and imposing some of the ideas of Victorian morality and enhancing the morality of Indians, enhancing, I'm using quote unquote, and introducing English education, particularly to create a group of people who would be Indian in color and blood, but British in intellect and thinking. And these are some of the things. I have a lot to share, but due to time constraint, and I'm sure we also have limited time for discussion. And my final observation is while the overriding British tried to, you know, communalize the secular minds, communalizing the secular minds. This is a very serious uh, thing which I have noticed from various missionary writings. By disowning idolatry and the Hindu cultural practices, how they were able to communalize the secular minds in the name of modernity or moral augmentation or material prosperity or religious neutrality. One has to be very careful how the British missionary agencies, particularly the agencies that created a different form of communal politics, which you won't be able to see. This is communal. But when you go a little deeper, you'll find that the threads that try to divide the people in a very sophisticated, these are the masks of conquest, of course, which I find it in some of the writings. And therefore, as a student of history, I find, despite the fact there are many studies on communalism or communal politics, one also has to take a critical look of the Victorian communal politics that had series of layers, and these layers had many ideas. Sometimes these ideas are controversial, sometimes these ideas are contentious, but these ideas were always imposed, these ideas were always normalized, and these ideas always were later legitimized. See, these three things. One is creating these forms of knowledge and introducing it these among the people and normalizing it. Because now you, if you look at history, if you ask the question if there is anything called Victorian communalism, people might say there's nothing, there's something called uh, Victorian communalism. People would definitely say there's nothing called Victorian communalism. But these ideas, therefore, need to be understood historically and critically. So, therefore, any study that helps us understand colonialism would be incomplete, particularly when it comes to communalism, if we don't give adequate importance to Protestantism and its idea of Victorian communalism. Thank you so much. I stop here. I would be very interested to have questions, and will try to respond to questions. So, whatever I have shared is not a gospel truth, as the title says, the gospel of Victorian communalism. It's always my findings. These ideas can be challenged on based on data. These ideas can be critiqued, but still, I would be happy to have criticisms, comments. But these are also part of the historical process that one should not or one cannot ignore or deliberately avoid it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for the
Thank you.
very well articulated, very well structured lecture, for giving us the background of communalism and for showing us that there are so many layers to it and so many nuances attached to it. So I request Nidhi to take up the questions.
Yes, we have a lot of questions, sir. So, first question is was the effect of Victorian communalism different on different colonies? Did other colonizers of India also have similar effects on Indian society?
Okay, so great. See, this is the term that is still emerging in the academia. So the for the first time, I see there's one or two scholars, not much, have used this term Victorian communalism. I'm trying to develop it a little further in my subsequent research studies. So therefore, I may not be able to comment on this, but I can only assume how this Victorian nationalism could perhaps be one of the major players in dividing the people, particularly as I told you in the beginning, in the case of Africa. So here you find mixed responses. When you look at from the people, they sometimes find that it's fine, that we are okay in disowning our cultural practices, some of which they may not, they may be told by the colonizers that this is not the way that people should live, particularly in terms of their faith. So now, if you look at the changing dynamics, particularly in Africa, this may not be applicable because the people you say that are you part of this Victorian politics, and most of them as people who change their faith to Christianity would say that they love their religion. So how do we say that this is part of the Victorian politics? As a historian, one can think of, but when you look at from a people's perspective, I don't think this term may not be acceptable by the people. But as a historian, I would definitely try to use it and apply it in the Indian context. But there are many books that seem to suggest that Victorian communalism, uh, was introduced in Africa, particularly in a different form and different forms, particularly education. Education was always seen as one of the very important symbols of not necessarily communalizing, but critiquing their cultural practice. So critiquing their cultural practice and creating a unique identity, and creating an identity of exclusion. If the identity is something which was intended for creating unity among the people, that is, I'm sure, is acceptable to all. But if the identity is something which is meant actually to divide, segregate, dominate, and finally for ruling the people, then it becomes an integral part of the Victorian uh, communalism. In India, this is what happened. I can say you a few examples in my area of research. In southern part of Tamil Nadu, then Madras Presidency, the missionaries were known for establishing separate, exclusive village settlements for their converts, and they have their own justification, because once you convert to their religion, you always face persecution from their own brothers and the own family and own your caste men, and therefore you are not supposed to live with them, and you are supposed to live in separate village settlements. So how do you look at it? Whether you look at as something which is a unifying factor, or which is something which divides the people, I'm leaving it to you to decide. So how this Victorian communalism really worked in different parts of the world, particularly in India. In the Northeast, you have ample evidences of such villages that were also meant for creating separate settlements for a specific community, and excluding them. And finally, the larger objective is to rule them, because they would be your submissive and loyal citizens. That's also one of the larger objectives of Victorian communalism. It's not just to make you to be a critical thinker, but always the intention is to make you to be a submissive and loyal citizen. How you can be a loyal British, uh, you know, citizen in the colonial sense of the term. Yes, thank you for this very
Thank,
interesting question.
thank you, sir.
Uh, the modern museum studies challenge the colonial narratives and cultural appropriation perpetuated by Victorian era museums. What is your opinion, Christhu ji? This question is asked by our honorary president Nandan Shastri ji. On behalf of sir, it is posted in the chat box.
Okay, so modern, can you just show the question once again? I'll read it too. Modern?
Sure, sir. Sure, sir.
Okay. Modern museum study challenge the colonial narrative and cultural appropriation perpetuated by Victorian era museums. Okay. So I have not worked much on heritage or museum, but from some of my experiences. And I think it's very, very important to contextualize. Maybe we can think of some of the acts that were introduced during the colonial times. And most importantly, the Heritage Preservation Acts. And at least in the 1905, when Carson was the Governor General, and he also made series of initiatives. And of course, you also find that these initiatives and the kind of curiosity that was shared or expressed by the colonial officials had its own limitations as well. But when you say the Indian studies or studies in recent times that challenge colonial narratives, I absolutely agree with you. For example, historians from Delhi University And some of the studies conducted in uh, at least in Jawaharlal Nehru University, not from Center for Historical Studies, but from other centers, arts and aesthetics, do suggest that there is an attempt going on to challenge the colonial narratives. So, why there is a need to challenge colonial narratives? That's a different question. So, there's a very recent article or study, Museum as Nation. So, the museum as nation identity, therefore, how museums helped heritage, always seen as part of nation in the making. So, as a student of history, therefore, I always find that heritage or the idea of heritage preservation and conservation always help us to understand how the nation is or was in the making, particularly in the post colonial context. And this is also in addition to the decolonization aspect, as decolonizing the mind or decolonizing the colonial narratives. One such attempt, I am not sure whether this has been a widespread phenomenon all over India, but at least the initiatives are really encouraging that one has to really go into the colonial narratives, because colonial narratives actually means that they always projected as they are the epitome of civilization. They're always seen as people who are capable of creating a civilization. For example, I can quote this idea of archaeological survey of India, Alexander Cunningham. So Alexander Cunningham, when it was seen that Indians were incapable of preserving their heritage. But even before Archaeological Survey of India, we have instances where the the cultural elements or the cultural aspects of the people, their identity were always preserved in one way or the other. Maybe most importantly, the palm leaves as a heritage. In Tamil Nadu, the Tirukural is also another example how people were keen on preserving their cultural aspects, their identity, their belief, practices, and most importantly, heritage. And one more word I would like to say, if history is considered as a record of the past, heritage should always be as celebration of the past. This is what I would like to see. History is always seen as a record of the past, and heritage must be seen as a celebration of the past. As long as we see heritage as a celebration of past, I don't think any attempt to decolonize would be very effective. So this is my preliminary understanding, but there are many other things also I can share, but due to time constraint, I think I can stop here.
Uh,
Yes, any
Thank you
other
very.
question?
Yes, sir. I have a few more questions, and there are two other questions also.
Yes,
I would like
please.
to ask my question. Has there been a drastic change in the perception of the meanings of the word secular and communal from their original intended meaning? And how has this affected the general understanding, or rather misunderstanding, of the people, the society as a whole, when we speak of contemporary scenario?
Okay, I think it's a very interesting question. And of course, I have used this in my book also. Maybe I can share this when the changing dynamics of the term communalism. See, I'm not using communalism in a generic term. So, what is particularly your question is secularism. Secularism in Europe may not be applicable in the Indian context, because the term secular or secularization or secularism is often seen as a phrase which is used in the in the early part of the 18th century, when there was a discussion that religion should be separated from politics, and the authority of the Pope, and therefore it is always seen that there should not be any connection between religion and politics. But in the Indian context, I don't find that is very much relevant, or anyone can think of applying it as it is. Because even in the case of 20th century discussion, you always find differences between Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, for example. So, as a person who would always say Jawaharlal Nehru, particularly after Gandhi's assassination, the secularism for him is equal respect to all religious traditions. And therefore, religion cannot come in the way of politics. And therefore, religion should be separated from politics. But as we all know, Gandhi has severe and serious disagreement with people like Jawaharlal Nehru. He would say, if anyone thinks that secular communalism, particularly religion, should not be mixed with politics, or religious ideas should not be mixed with politics, that person doesn't know exactly what religion is all about. So you see, if you have differences between Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, and there are differences between political class and theologians in Europe, and this I find therefore is not static; it is fluid. These phrases are fluid, and I'm not using any scholars' discussion or debates. My definition, therefore, scholars, Bipan Chandra or other scholars who have written extensively on communalism or secularism, have their own definition. My definition is actually, you know, emanates from the Protestant tradition of communitarianism. So that's why I said this secularism for me is someone who believes in respect to all religious tradition, but doesn't believe in the monopoly of truth. This is the basic definition. So, monopoly of truth. Whoever believes in the monopoly of truth, which is my way is highway, other religions are fake, there comes the problem. And this is what the Protestant or Protestantism, or the ideology that emanates from Protestant ethics or Protestant ideology, needs to be critically examined. Whereas communalism, I am using here largely in the context of, again, Protestantism. How communalism, or those who believe in this communalism, is an ideology which is particularly parochial. It's a divisive. It is sectarian. And this is, I'm sure, understandable for all of us. But again, this question comes, this communalism believed in the principle of monopoly of truth. So the central argument between secularism and communalism, it's centered around monopoly of truth, which most of the scholars have not discussed, and which is why I'm taking this subject more seriously. So for them, communalism, it's mostly defined in the political sense of the term. You're mobilizing people for communal politics, or vote banking politics. I'm not discussing that aspect. That may be true. I'm not denying that aspect. I'm going back to the roots of this communal politics. So, if there is no consensus among people that others also have equal right to, share their faith and respect their faith, as long as this mutual respect for religious traditions are recognized, I don't think there is no place for communal politics. India has always been a secular country. We all know, despite the fact that differences, dissimilarities, from ancient times, at least till the medieval period, as long as it had major encounters from invaders or marauders or looters from other parts of the world. In India, we always have a kind of, you know, a kind of unity in diversity. This is our strength. But the colonial government is known notoriously for its monopoly of truth and their agencies, particularly. If you look at all the reformist movements and the initiatives, abolition of what the supposedly social evils, the education, the morality, the institutional establishments, and other things clearly indicate that yes, secularism and communalism are constantly changing, and therefore, I still believe there will many scholars who will redefine the idea of secularism and communalism, maybe in the days to come. They can also challenge the existing works of students of history like me and others also can challenge. We have to welcome and move on, asking new questions. Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you. This is a question from my teacher, Professor Shilazar Mugri. Whether the non-British missionaries also considered British government as their enemy, or did their enmity only limit to the British missionaries?
Whether non-British missionaries also consider the British government as their enemies, or it only applies British missionaries. Um, well, I think it's very important. Again, this is a very interesting question. um, the period that I am looking at, it's a very controversial period, particularly the 19th and the early part of the 20th centuries. But you always find, to answer your question, I need to go back a little early. Maybe the Portuguese, Dutch, Danish, and the German, for example. There always used to be constant conflict between Germans and the British, at least in South India. So Germans, particularly, who played a very important role from 1706, and Germans were the first Protestant missionaries. I'm sure all of you may be familiar with Ziegenbalg. Is the one who translated New Testament and Bible in particular, and he was the one who was arriving at the Danish colony Tranquebar, and he was not allowed, and later he was asked to leave the country, but somehow he was able to manage, finally settled at Tranquebar. Now the Tamil Nadu government is trying to construct maybe a memorial for Tranquebar for his contribution to Tamil language. This is another kind of politics which is going on in Tamil Nadu. Now, the point is, yes, you are right. There always was a constant conflict between Portuguese missionaries and um, we have time. Portuguese missionaries and Dutch missionaries. In my case study, I always find innumerable case studies between German missionaries, the constant conflicts between German missionaries and the British. Wherever the British send their missionaries, the Germans would not, vice versa. And the larger idea is the language, because the British were known for their lazy and lethargic attitude towards vernacular language, which is this is what the language of the Germans. The Germans, whereas on the other hand, were known for their inquisitiveness to learn the vernacular languages so quickly. I'm not making any sweeping generalization. You have exceptional cases like Robert Caldwell, who was known for the popular historical contribution, uh, the Dravidian languages, Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, Malayalam. He made a comparative analysis. There are exceptional cases, but you always find that Germans, Britons hardly went hand in hand. They hardly interacted, at least. There were divisions in the church. And particularly when it comes to sponsorship and the establishment of schools and the establishment of the institutions, particularly church and other missionary organizations. Now, in the 19th century, you always find that there is a kind of consensus among the British, even though it changes after the First World War. Uh, the missionaries were discouraged to apply or come to India, largely because of political reasons. Because in some cases, missionaries uh, were found to be anti-colonial. So you have tensions between British and German missionaries on the one side. On the other side, even among the British missionaries, and with some exceptions, American missionaries, Baptists. So Baptist missionaries were criticized by the colonial government very brutally for their anti-colonial sentiments. Some of the missionaries even started appreciating Gandhian politics, and Gandhi became their hero, and they stopped their proselytization, and they used International Congress flag in their ashrams. They started setting up Christian ashrams. Even though they came to India primarily for proselytization, after seeing Gandhi's, and Gandhi became almost Indian Christ. That's the beauty of the change in terms of politics, which I have explained maybe in the first book of mine, India After 1857 Revolt. I would love to share it. Maybe since this is a question that is of interest to me, maybe if you share your email ID with the organizer, then I would definitely share the book also. It is, yes, you are right. There were constant conflicts, and missionaries were also suspected by the colonial government because they are Americans, and American missionaries were always with Gandhi, and Gandhi was projected as India's Christ. This is the development in the 1920s and 1930s. Thank you for asking this question.
Thank you, sir. There's a question by Sudeep. As a
Yes.
reader who's not from history or academic background, I'm curious what is the difference between communalism and sectarianism?
Well, as I understand it, communalism, at least as I understand, I am using my own terminology. I'm not using any other scholars. Communalism is an parochial ideology that believes in the monopoly of truth, that practices the monopoly of truth, that believes in the imposition, dissemination, proselytization, and conversion. And therefore, you call such people are people with communal mindset. I'm not going into the 20th century definition. I'm going back to the root of the communal ideology. Communionism, community, communitarianism, and communalism. And sectarianism, yes, sectarianism is something which believed in the division among different sects, maybe Catholics and Protestants. And the sectarianism is often used, most importantly, as I told in the beginning of my lecture, was very much prevalent in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland. For example, Northern Ireland, you always find there is a very sectarian violence. This is the exact word which is very much applicable in the context of Northern Ireland. I don't know much about this sectarian violence in other parts of India. Of course, we always use sectarianism and communalism interchangeably, but I don't think they are all, both the terms are equal. But in my understanding, sectarianism is again Catholics, Protestant, like you have in Islam, Sunni and Shia, and in ancient tradition, Vaishnavism, Shaivism, maybe. And this Protestantism and Catholic sect was always seen as a classic example of sectarian politics. And I think this is also based on, and in India, the sectarianism in among the missionaries you find in some cases when Portuguese missionaries were converting the fishing communities in Goa and some parts of Kerala in the 16th, 17th century, the British Protestant missionaries who believed in the monopoly of truth, they said the Catholics need to be converted to Protestantism. That was actually considered as a real conversion. This is a classic example of sectarianism. So you are creating a sect, Protestant sect or Protestant religious tradition, and by reconverting the Catholics into Protestant tradition. So how do you call it? I don't think it is anyway can be termed as communal, but it is also in a way related to the sectarian aspect that was predominantly or explicitly expressed in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is a very classic example. Maybe I can share some of the readings on this very recent studies on this particular sectarianism, religious sectarianism I'm talking about, between Catholics and Protestants, and how the Protestants treated the Catholics and how the Catholics felt that they were excluded and therefore segmented, treated separately, and therefore they considered, they were forced to think that they were a different sect in their own country. And this is also an integral part of what I have used Victorian communalism. So this Victorian communalism actually emerges from sectarian politics that is deeply rooted in Irish politics, and particularly in the Northern Ireland. Thank you for this very interesting question.
Thank you, sir. There are actually 3 to 4 more questions, but we
Yes.
can take up a couple more if, with your permission.
Yes, yes.
So this is a question by Dr. Sumantraj Chopra. Communalism word used for India. In other parts of the world, for example, crusades were not called as communalism. So why is that word used in the context of India is his question.
Okay, communalism was communalism. Can you just show it once again, Nidhi? Communalism word used
Yes.
for India. In another parts of the world, for example, crusades were not called as communalism. Okay, so I find from my limited understanding, these terms cannot be used interchangeably, because for me, these terms emerged and therefore these are histories of circumstances, terminologies of circumstances. So I also wondered how this communalism was used in the European context. Whenever you use communalism, it is often seen as in the Indian context. So when I was reading this Victorian communalism, I definitely asked a lot of questions to myself, how this communalism was used in European context. Then when I, made repeated attempts to understand and contextualize it, it is Victorian communalism. But if you ask me this communalism, as I am repeating this communalism, I am not using particularly as it is understood in the history textbooks in the 19th century, as a student, I always would love to go back to the roots. Monopoly of truth is the premise for me to understand communalism. That may not be applicable in the 20th century communal politics. That, of course, has its roots that took different shape. But the crusade, I think we often use, or it has been used in a different context. Maybe it's inter-religious tensions, to study really inter-religious tensions. When communalism is often sometimes used, there's also inter-religious tensions. But communalism also can be used inter-religious tensions and intra-religious tensions. Intra-religious tension, communalism used between Catholics and Protestants in the European context, particularly with specific reference to, I'm again going back to the Northern Ireland case. But the Crusades, I'm all of you are aware of it. Mostly the Christians, particularly Catholics and Muslims. I'm sure this is a war of crusades. That's very often. So you are free to use this in the Indian context also. But how do we justify or validate that could possibly a huge challenge? Like the way I am picking up this Victorian communalism that was used largely in the European context, I am trying to apply it in the Indian context. And the wars of crusades also can be definitely used. It depends on the sources, the data, and the approach and interpretations. I'm not saying this cannot be used. I'm also being optimistic in this particular uh, question, that it depends on how do we see it, how do we look at it, and how do we problematize it, how do we ask questions, and how do we use our sources to substantiate our argument. And therefore, I am seeing these two things emerged from a different historical context. And therefore, I am little skeptical about using this as interchangeable terms. If you wish to use it, you can use it, but it all depends on how we approach it, and it also depends on the sources that we have. So, and again, I'm going back to R.C. Majumdar's argument. The history can be looked at differently, but it cannot be looked at differently if you don't have adequate amount of sources, data that can substantiate our argument. But I don't find any major study that used crusades in the Indian context. Maybe there may be few studies, but that may not be very directly addressing towards the issues that Indian religious traditions, about Indian religious traditions. Yes, thank you. This question.
Thank you very much, sir. Sir, there are last three questions which are all by me. I will just post them on the screen, and we will just take up the last question. The other two questions,
Sure.
you can give me the answers later on, so if that is okay. Were there any efforts from within the colonial powers that tried to counter the communalism? So the communalism which they perpetuated themselves. Then,
Okay.
yes, sir. So if you want to, then the next question that I asked was, did Victorian communalism add another layer of divide to an already existing system of divisions in India, or did it set up an entirely new parallel system which was unique from the pre-existing ones? And the last one is not a question. I'm just asking you to highlight the need of such studies as yours, where we go back to the root of the issue in addressing contemporary complex challenges that are repercussions of things that have ceased to exist long ago.
Okay. I think it's very important to ask such critical questions. So I think these questions are relevant. when we understand or when we try to understand different layers of communalism. So, for me, communalism is not a monolithic construct. It is a construct of colonial government. It is a construct maybe from within, or it is a construct from multiple players. These three dimensions that I would try to emphasize. Now, as far as the Victorian communalism, whether any attempts were made to challenge communal politics during colonial times, I think, as I already mentioned, that there are few organizations. There are few organizations in southern part of India and northern part of India and Bengal, and particularly Uttar Pradesh. So this was always seen as a struggle between Protestant ethics and Sanatan Dharma. So this is a very, very important. So whether they were able to be successful in their attempts, that's really a difficult question to answer. So these organizations, I'm looking at this organization, particularly the socio-religious reform movements that we see in Indian history, are also directly or indirectly challenging the Victorian communal politics. So when the Victorian communal politics tried to take control of certain issues, certain cultural traditions, beliefs, practices of the Indian, particularly the colonized masses, and most importantly, Hindus, and you always find a counter narratives. So the counter narratives came either in the form of individual reformer or institutionalization of reforms, and third, counter ideology, particularly education. And you also find in the anti-colonial nationalism, particularly in the 20th century, you have national education, vernacular education, and Gandhi's idea of education. And you also find how these constant tensions between colonialism and decolonization, communalism and secularization, right? So, communalism and secularization, Victorian communalism, and defending the cultural and the civilizational values of India under the broader theme of defending the values and the ideals of Sanatan Dharma. That was always one would notice in the 19th and the second part of the 20th centuries. Now, yes, it is in this context I would definitely agree with you that these ideas, particularly communalism and Victorian communalism, need to be understood largely in the context of Protestant ethics. And as I have already explained in the third section of my presentation, why the idea of Victorian communalism need to be revisited, because it is an integral part of colonial project of cultural control. So it cannot be simply seen as a political ideology. It is closely linked with the cultural project of controlling the masses, and therefore it is a project that is closely linked with the colonizing mind of the people, colonizing the mind. Now people talk about now decolonization. So decolonization is also a process. But my question and little worry is whether decolonization is a successful one if you don't understand the roots of communal politics. And therefore, if you want to make decolonization project an effective one, an efficient one has to go back to the roots, as you have asked the importance of the role played by colonialism, particularly through the Protestant ethics and Victorian communalism. So, and one more point I would like to add here, and this is part of my research also. So, the Victorian communalism is normally, uh, seen as something which cannot be noticed easily because it comes in the form of modernity, it comes in the form of modernization, not necessarily Europeanization, but modernity and modernization or advancement or moral values, enhancing moral values or material prosperity. And when the supporters, therefore, of colonial modernity maintain that the struggle for attire equality or equality of people, one also should understand the implication of the Victorian communalism may not be very explicitly expressed, but it has a long lasting effects. This is also which I find as something which the colonialism was successful, remarkably successful in their endeavor, which people may not be able to notice it easily. And this is in such a way they were able to introduce it, impose it, and normalize it. And we also accept it as a part of natural historical process. And how would we be able to question it? And therefore, this is something which was a silent revolution. It was a silent revolution. I'm not using revolution in the positive sense of the term. It is a revolution, mostly a paradigm shift. The culture, the educated Indian class. If you read K.M. Panikar's book, I often wonder in my lecture why and how K.M. Panikar in his book Nationalism always uses the phrase how colonialism, missionary politics, and Victorian morality created, and of course, Victorian morality, I'm also using Western education, English education also. All these things were successful in creating a group of people who were made to be loyal or were made to be moderates, moderates, and which is why we call in the Indian National Congress moderates, extremists, radicals. And K.M. Panikar would say these moderates, of course, fine. But who are these moderates? How they were made to lose their cultural roots. They were made to disown their own cultural identity. They were looking something from above, from the Western civilization. And the most important victory the colonial British, even today, can claim is they were able to make their story, tell their story so beautifully that their civilization was superior than ours, which the British were able to do it. And the Portuguese were miserably failed to do this, even though they tried, the Dutch tried, the Danish tried, the French tried to establish their superiority. But finally, the British were able to make their story more powerful because they were successful in convincing the colonized subjects that their civilization was superior to the colonized subjects. It is in this context the leaders of the first national level political organization, Indian National Congress, which some scholars would call moderates. For K.M. Panikar, these moderates were none other than denationalized patriots. Denationalized patriots. So I maybe you may be thinking that these terms are very ideologically loaded. But when you say the ideologically loaded statement, denationalized patriot, one also should know how they were nationalized national, and because of certain um negotiations that they were able to make with the British, and the ways in which they admitted that India's civilization is inferior to the West, it is a huge success to Victorian communalism. You don't have to say much about Victorian communalism. This is the only classic example that I can think as of now. Even though K.M. Panikkar doesn't use the word Victorian communalism, but the ways in which they were able to convince the colonized subjects that the British had higher civilization, higher moral values, superior civilizational ethos, clearly indicate that their Victorian morality, Victorian communal politics in India seem to have been a successful story. So, how to challenge it, how to relook at it, how to re-examine it is what that as students of history we can do. We cannot undo what has happened, but we can definitely go back and learn lessons and try to make some efforts at least to challenge certain colonial narratives. Therefore, we can create at least something new in terms of narratives. How colonialism, particularly Victorian communalism, coupled with the superior civilizational values and the scientific advancements and the supposedly moral superior moral values, clearly convinced, had the potential to convince the educated Indian leaders and who were not able to challenge that rhetoric of the colonial British. That itself is an indication how the British were able to be successful in their politics of communalizing the secular minds. Yes, thank you for
Thank you.
these thought provoking questions.
Yes, Nidhi.
Sir, two more questions are there. With your permission, can we take them? These
Yes,
will be
yes,
the
of course.
questions.
Yes, of course.
Uh,
Yes, please.
question is, how did the Muslims react to Victorian communalism?
Okay. So, how did Muslims reacted to Victorian communalism? Now, I think it's very important. I wanted to share a very interesting story. This Jones, for example, William Jones, I'm sure we all know as someone who is always known for his Orientalism, Orientalist knowledge. And now I think it's a very important thing that we need to know. In addition to being a Orientalist, he was also a strong supporter of missionary politics. And those of you who want to read more can go through William Jones' discourses delivered before Asiatic Society, starting from 1784 and it goes till 1824. Discourses delivered before the Asiatic Society. This is also part of my ongoing project, book proposal. Now, here he talks about Muslims and Hindus. We all know about William Jones, Asiatic Society of Bengal, 1784. And here he talks about a very important ideas. And here, for the first time, I see he uses controversial dichotomies, such as us and them, as British, them colonized. It's a dichotomy. And here he also talks about how to extend Christianity in Hindustan, particularly among Hindus and Muslims. And he also feels that there are some sad obstacles to the extension of Christianity among Muslims and Hindus. I'm saying this because the missionary attitude towards Hindus are completely different from their attitude towards Muslims. If you ask me, they were keen on converting Muslims. We hardly have any major, enthusiasm among the missionaries who wanted to convert Muslims. Now, when I read William Jones, I'm able to connect the dots. For example, he said, um, India needs a general extension of Christianity. For him, Christianity is the pure faith, unadulterated pure faith. Now you understand why I'm talking about monopoly of truth. See, this is William Jones who is talking about. This is not a missionary's language. This is a language of Orientalist scholar, which the world celebrates, is not completely free from fault lines. So one of the major fault lines is that he wanted to disseminate the pure faith, which is Christianity, in Hindustan, and for which he said there are many sad obstacles. I'm coming back to your actual question. William Jones says the Muslims are already a sort of heterodox Christians. Muslims are already Christians, heterodox. And they are Christians. And he also uses John Locke's argument. I'm sure all of you are familiar with John Locke. They are Christians if John Locke reasons justly because they firmly believe the immaculate conception, divine character, and miracles of Christ. And therefore, they are Christians. You don't have to convert them. But they are heterodox in denying vehemently Jesus as the Son of God and his equality as God with Father, of whose unity and attributes they entertain and express the most awful ideas. Now, it's very important. They are also scared of Muslims. You know why? He also considers the doctrine of Christians as a perfect blasphemy. They also know what would happen to them because if they cross the limits. And they insist that their copies of scriptures have been corrupted by both Christians and Jews, and therefore they would have serious objection. So let's therefore be very careful in interacting with Muslims, even though they are often seen as Christians. On the one hand, unfortunately, on the other, they also were aware of that their ideas of proselytization, their ideas of Son, Father, God, Holy Spirit would definitely amount to the blasphemy. And therefore, they say it will be inexpressibly difficult to undeceive them, undeceive the Muslims, and scarce them possible to diminish their veneration for Muhammad and Ali, who are both extraordinarily men. See, they accepted the fact both Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad and Ali were both extraordinary men and with unexceptionable morals. And they also accept the fact that Quran shines indeed with borrowed light. Most of the writings, according to missionaries, particularly, I'm not talking about Muslims. I'm talking about the Asiatic Society of Bengal's founder William Jones. He says the Quran shines indeed with a borrowed light, since most of its beauties are taken from our scriptures, Bible. But it has great beauties. And therefore, they have try to understand that Muslims will not be convinced that they were borrowed or they would be able to convert to Christianity. But on the other hand, William Jones had an unshakable conviction when it comes to Hindus. He says the Hindus, on the other hand, would readily admit the truth of the gospel. Again, I'm coming back to square one. Communalism is nothing but an ideology that believes in monopoly of truth. Communalism is a parochial ideology that advocated the monopoly of truth. I'm not saying here it is, you know, it's very important. William Jones, he is the one who is saying, and therefore, for them, Hindus are more easily can be converted, and Muslims can never be converted. Now, the question doesn't arise whether they are also becoming part of the larger politics of gospel, particularly the gospel of the Victorian communalism. But he also says the Hindus would readily admit the truth of the gospel, but they would definitely contend that it is perfectly consistent with their shastras. This is what the Brahmins also did, and Gandhi, of course, did. Whatever Gita says, it's also in Bible. Whatever Bible says, Gita also has. And therefore, Gandhi was able to challenge the missionary politics. And the clear dichotomy, us versus them, and again reinforcing the pure faith, which is Christianity, and being skeptical of the heterodox nature of Muslims, and being very well aware of the Hindus and their capability of converting Hindus because of their limited understanding of their own scriptures, clearly tell us that the Victorian communalism had some specific agenda targeting specific social groups. I don't think their Muslims have any major role to play. I'm not saying that Muslims were completely excluded from the Victorian communal politics, but compared to other social groups like Hindus in particular, their missionary politics, maybe some places when it comes to Parda, missionary politics, where there's seclusion, I have written it in one of my articles that I also would love to share with you all. The pedagogy of seclusion, women and the politics of modernity in colonial India. But when it comes to conversion, proselytization, and sharing their pure faith, I really ask many questions about whether they really had the time to interact with Muslim like the way they had encountered Hindus. Thank you for such wonderful thought-provoking questions.
Uh, Thank you very much, sir. This is becoming one of the most interactive and interesting sessions that we have had. So there is an observation made in the comment section here. So missionaries and East India Company had disagreements. There was also disagreements between British aristocracy and the Scots who came to India despite these differences. Despite these differences, why do we historians mostly look at the British colonialism and its impact as a monolithic entity?
Okay, so I think it's a very important question. I think in the beginning of my talk itself, I said, so the talk is not about making any sweeping generalization. So the case in Madras presidency was completely different from the case in Bombay presidency. And the Bombay presidency case or model of colonialism or missionary politics was completely different from the politics they had in Bengal presidency. So therefore, there's no question of attempting to create any monolithic identity of colonialism and missionary politics. The second important observation to this question is As I already told you, you know, how the colonial government prefer to work within the larger missionary agencies. That's my precisely the point is. Um, I am not saying, therefore, all the East India Company officials till 1857 or the British officials or governor generals after 1858, after the company administration was transferred to the British, which we often call British Raj. The beginning stages, of course, I completely agree that their objective was to create uh, their own survival mechanism of survival through trade, commerce, industry, and economic imperialism. But what happens after subsequent periods? 1757, you have consolidation, and 1857, particularly East India Company's transfer of power to the British Parliament, and thereby we have the British Raj. Now, since then, I find, even though they've worked differently on different platforms and different ideologies, they always had a kind of consensus. For example, from 1813, why there is a need for the British to allow proselytizing missionaries to come to India if their mission was purely, ruling the people or ruling the colonized? This is one aspect. Second, why there is a need for the British to establish um, ecclesiastical department in India, even though it was actually meant for the colonial officials in the first place. Second, third question, why the colonial government was keen on recruiting missionaries in the University of Madras or University Bengal, Calcutta University, or Bombay University in 1857. These are the universities I'm sure all of you are familiar with. You always find missionaries, at least some of the missionaries were part of the larger educational programs. We might say, yes, since they were expertise on certain fields. For example, Robert Caldwell was also the part of some of the educational programs of Madras presidents. You might say that he was an expert in Tamil, but he was also influential in putting forward some of his interests. In Bombay presidency, also, you find there are missionaries who are also part of their larger educational program. Now, my larger understanding, it's not just to make any sweeping generalization, or creating any monolithic identity. It is, of course, not about monolithic identity, but it's all about how they were able to work in an atmosphere where their unity was displayed more powerfully than their disunity. I'm not saying they had no problems. Of course, I can say there were problems. There were problems because, for example, in Madras presidency, when missionaries were found, colonial officials were found to be missionary organization, that district collector was asked to quit, and he had to resign his job and go back to England. Similarly, you also find governor generals or viceroys were actively donating their money directly or indirectly, not necessarily always in their official capacity. For example, this was the case in 1870s and 1890s. And for example, this Bengali trio, I'm sure you are familiar with in Bengal. The governor generals completely have believed the credibility of the Bengal missionaries. They were often seen to be the father of Protestant missionary or English missionaries. William Carey, for example. So, how do we situate it? This is not about, I think, saying that missionaries and the colonial government work together harmoniously with perfect unity and integrity. No, never. But they needed missionaries, particularly when it comes to Western medicine, when it comes to education, when it comes to uh, doing certain jobs as anthropologists. How many of us know missionaries worked as anthropologists for colonial government? How do we look at it? So missionaries, they were not missionaries merely for the propagation of Christianity. They also worked certain worked in certain capacities that helped the colonial government to fulfill their agenda. Anthropology is just one just view. The census report, for example. So when Sati was becoming a huge issue, who was the one who helped the government? It was a missionary. We often remember Rajaram Mohan Rai, but we also need to remember the missionary who gave the data, raw data to colonial government, on the basis of which only the colonial government acted, and the missionaries also became part of this larger socio-religious reform, the social-religious reform movements, but the initiatives, the reform, so-called reforms of the colonial British. So missionaries will always be part of it. And most importantly, which is the reason why in the course of my discussion, I said missionaries asserted constantly that all the friends of the colonial rulers were their friends. All the enemies of the colonial rulers were their enemies. How can this assertion happen without any cordial atmosphere? And all, I think, aspects clearly tell us that there were more similarities than differences. I am not saying there was no difference. I am not saying that missionaries and colonial government worked hand in hand in a perfect harmony. No, never. But missionaries needed colonial government for funding. Missionaries needed colonial government for moral support. Missionaries needed colonial government for institutional establishments. Similarly, colonial officials also needed missionaries for the spiritual good of, of the colonized subjects. And therefore, you find the terms Christians and Britons. Christians and Britons. These two terms often used constantly by both missionaries and, uh, of course, colonial political class. So, why do I quote uh, the William Jones argument? Because normally, as of William Jones, we understand that he is a scholar of international repute as a Orientalist. How many of us know that he also closely worked with the missionaries? He was also influenced by the Protestant ideology, Protestant ethics. And each organization and their affiliation may be different, ideologically may be different, but they always prefer to be part of the larger identity as Christians. They also were willing to be part of the larger identity as Britons. So, how many of us can challenge that missionaries and colonial political class never used these two identities? Of course, they always used these identities. And therefore, one has to be very careful when making sweeping generalization that missionaries and Christian or political class worked hand in hand with perfect harmony. They never fought each other, and they never challenged each other's ideology. If any such claim is made, I would be very critical about this. But on the other hand, we cannot completely dismiss that how these two entities prefer to work within the larger identities. I'm not saying identity, identities. One is Christian identity, and second is British identity. When you say Christian identity, predominantly is a Protestant identity. When you say Protestant identity, Protestant ethics played a crucial role. And it is in this context, Protestantism or discussing Protestantism without Victorian morality will be incomplete for me. And therefore, Protestantism, Victorian morality, the rhetoric of modernity, and the politics of Victorian communalism, for me, are connected histories. They are not separate watertight compartments. I hope I make it. I'm able to convince what I wanted to say. I repeat this again. Protestantism, Protestant ethics or ideology, communitarianism, communionism, and communalism. They're all connected histories. So you cannot understand one aspect of it without analyzing other connected histories. So, therefore, any attempt to understand communalism would be incomplete without adequately analyzing the ideas of Protestantism, the ideas of communitarianism, the idea of communism, and therefore the idea of Victorian morality. So everything is interconnected. You cannot separate one from another. If you connect one thing from another, it will be like taking a fish out of water, and there will be no meaning to it. Thank you, Puneet, for such a wonderful question.
Thank you so much, sir, for such a wonderful interactive session. Coming to the end of the session, what message would you like to give for the history enthusiasts? Any particular suggestion, message?
So I am speechless as far as the ways in which history enthusiasts, as a team of budding historians, have been working on. I have been closely following your uh, the ways in which you organize talks, speeches, and I would love to be part of your team. If any way that you can think that I can be of help, I will definitely. I am available. I am at your disposal. And secondly, you can also think of inviting young scholars who may be doing PhD to share their ideas. Normally, we see historians who work in institutions of international national repute are only called for sharing their thoughts, but sometimes the young minds have more vibrant ideas that also need to be discussed. As far as our UCHS is concerned, we also do take such initiatives of asking young budding historians to share their PhD work and interact with their fellow scholars. And together, as students of history, I always consider myself as a student of history, and which is why you have the unlimited freedom to ask questions like the way you want, and thereby I'm again reminded of what R.G. Collingwood says: every new generation must rewrite history. Every new historian should not be satisfied by answering to old questions. Each of us should be keen on asking new questions. And by asking new questions, I mean organizing many such talks will create platform for asking new questions, like the way I had series of questions. I always enjoyed, attending to these questions because these questions help me to reformulate my ideas. I'm sure history enthusiasts, you are doing a wonderful job. I am so proud of the work that you have been doing. And let's together, as history enthusiasts, I'm also part of history enthusiasts, and I have really an unshakable conviction that your team will be able to do a great job. But one thing is very clear: as new generation of historians, we should not be satisfied by answering to all questions. But otherwise, there's no point in me, for me to discuss communalism. Communalism has been thoroughly studied, analyzed. But what is something new in it? And that's the reason why I have picked up this Victorian communalism as a topic which has not been discussed by major or in major historical studies. This could possibly be one of the very uh, earliest discussions that we have. Maybe we can think of exploring it, and I'm sure you will continue to do a great job as students of history. So I'm always available for any uh, you know assistance as and when your team requires. Thank you once again, Professor, and all the two budding historians for giving me this opportunity to share, interact. And finally, this is not the gospel. This is a discussion. This discussion can be discussed. This discussion can be challenged. And of course, this discussion can be contested through new sources and by reinterpreting the existing sources. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you, sir. Thank you so
sir.
much.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I would like to take the opportunity to just mention something here. So first of all, your lecture has been very, very informative. Not lecture, an interactive session. And as you said, we are committed to bringing out new scholars, new studies from young researchers. We have always said this, and I want to reiterate. Our platform is open to young researchers, the PhD scholars who are doing their studies on various topics. You can present your findings here. You can present book reviews of any new volumes that you have been studying. So we are always open. Our platform is always accessible to everyone. Kindly contact us if you have something to share with the world, and we will definitely host you. So that is
Thank
what I
you.
wanted.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
So
Thank you so much.
Thank you
I
so
now
much.
request our President Shri Nandan Shastri sir to propose the vote of thanks.
On behalf of the history enthusiast group and on my personal behalf, I thank Christu very much for a very thoughtful talk and uh, answering questions very elaborately and taking much interest in this interactive session. And it is already 2 hours 30 minutes session. So
Wow.
let me quickly thank Nidhi for introducing you and Manali to give welcome address and taking most of the part in asking the questions on behalf of the members. Uh, and I thank the audience very much for their patience and interest in this interactive session. Thanks to all. Bye bye.
Thank you so much, sir. It's absolutely my pleasure. I thoroughly enjoy. We'll get connected. Thank you
Yeah.
all.
Namaste.
Namaste.
Thank you all very much. Thank you all the audience members for being with us for 2.5 hours and for your active participation. And we will all see you again with something new, something very soon. So do contact us if you have something to present or uh, through our channel. We are always here. Signing off here. Wish you all a very happy Ganesh Chaturthi tomorrow.
Thank you so